So we're here in the Border Museum in Berlin, one of the great collections of sculpture in the world. And what we're going to do today is have a conversation between three religious traditions, which we represent, about some of our shared inheritance and particular individual figures in our different traditions who we share. So I'm Ben Quash. I teach Christian theology in London, at King's College London, and I'm also an Anglican priest. And I'd love you to introduce yourselves too.
I am Rabbi Gisa Edelberg. My synagogue is just across the river, actually, in the park, and the Oranienburger Straße Synagogue here in Berlin.
My name is Mira Zivas. I'm a Muslim theologian at Humboldt University, and I teach Islamic theology.
Well, I feel like the guest in this city, and it's lovely to meet you both. Thinking of figures we share, thinking of figures that go right back to the very origins of our traditions, we couldn't go much further back than the first two humans. And we want to focus particularly today on one of them, and that's Eve, who we see here on the right, in this little limestone carving which dates from around 1514. It's a German relief sculpture. And Gisa, I wondered if you'd begin by just telling us about how Eve appears in the Hebrew Bible, which is, of course, also the Christian Old Testament.
I think what's really interesting is that we start off our tradition by two different stories about the same event. And one of them is what people mostly know, and the other one is a little bit more hidden, but actually that's the one I like more, because when God creates human, he creates them Betzalmenu Kidmutenu, in the image of God. And then it continues, Zacharu nekeva baraotam, male and female, he created, God created them, which is a good question what that means really. And then we have the other tradition where it says that first Adam was created as the prototype of the human, and then he felt lonely, and then Eve was created out of his body. Difficult discussion if that's only the rib or if it's really his half. And she was created Ezer Kenegdo, as an helper standing next to him, opposite of him. And I think the moment which we see in the picture is just before they are thrown out of the paradise, when they grab the fruit. Usually people say it's an apple, but in the Bible it doesn't say it's an apple, it's just the fruit. Actually, the serpent is missing in the picture.
I think there is, actually.
Right?
There's a tiny serpent in the top right. You can just see his head
yes, I see it now.
peeping down. But you're right, it's a little bit unusually in this image that there's a sort of double presence of wickedness.
Yes.
Because the serpent who tempts Adam and Eve and is discussed in the Bible is there, but also this monkey at the bottom left, which is not in the book of Genesis, but represents a traditional iconography, Christian iconography, of human lust, greed, malice. And so the monkey is in a way representing the baser nature of these two figures. But the fruit is important. Tell us about the fruit.
I'm always baffled actually by the story, because the serpent talks to Eve and they discuss that it's the tree of knowledge, and if you eat the fruit then you can distinguish between good and bad. And actually somehow I think it's good if we're able to distinguish between good and bad. So it's a long discussion also in our traditions, I think, what is really the original sin here. And then the text continues and says, and their eyes were open and they see that they were naked, so they went and got some clothes and were thrown out of paradise. In the picture, I really like how they look at each other, and it's really a very equal situation between the two of them, right?
Yeah. Mira, tell us a bit about how Eve appears in the Quran.
I'm afraid I have to say that Eve doesn't appear with her name in the Quran at all. So in the Islamic tradition, she's called Hawa, and in the Quran, we don't have one single creation narrative, but several times the story of the creation is told. And in one of these versions, in particular in Surah 20, Taha in Arabic, we have the story of Adam and his wife, or Adam. Even the translation wife is controversial here. So it's zawj, so it's one part of a pair. So Adam and his partner, perhaps we could say. And then the story is roughly along the same lines, I would say. So perhaps one difference, but I'm not sure if you already have mentioned it, it's the big question, who took the fruit? Who was the first person to take the fruit? And I would say that this depiction is a quite Islamic one, because it's Adam who took the fruit first.
Nice.
It's interesting you read it like that, because Eve, in a rather commanding way, is seizing the branch. And I find that really interesting, that she seems to have quite a lot of agency here.
She has.
She's got the branch. It's as if maybe she's pulled it down to make the fruit accessible.
Maybe she's the enabler, kind of putting her in a very female traditional role. You know, she enables Adam to grab the fruit. Could be.
But he did. He
took it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I know there are some readings of this in Christian circles which regard Adam as a little bit stupid. I mean, in the sense that he just does what he's told. There's no real initiative on his part. Eve says, well, you should try this, and he goes, ooh, okay. Whereas she has a more active role in the story, which could be read as making her more culpable. She's more responsible for this if it's read, you know, as it traditionally is, as sin, as a wicked act, a disobedient act. But on the other hand, you could read it as, you know, somehow someone with a bit more creative initiative, and Adam is just following along.
If we look at the two in that picture, they are also nearly the same size. So there's a lot of equality there, and I like that. I mean, if we go back into the text, is it Adam also in the Quran?
It's Adam, yeah.
Okay. And it's so the Hebrew really says it's the human being is called Adam because he comes from Ha'adama, from the earth. So it's this very creative thing. And Eve, or in Hebrew Chava, which I think I just heard in Hawa, comes from the word of Chayim, of life. So she's also then described as the mother of all life, which is a very interesting thing. You know, very often you have a female body described as the earth and the male planting something into the earth, and here it's the other way around, right? There is in later Jewish tradition the picture of Adam Harishon, the first human being as large as the earth itself. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow.
That's,
go on.
if I may say, it's also part of the Islamic tradition. So in some places you can visit graves of perhaps not Adam and Eve, but the descendants of them. And you always see that the graves of these descendants are meters long. Because Islamic tradition also has this idea that people used to be a lot taller than they are today, and a lot means 10 meters or so.
I love the fact that Eve in Hebrew means life. And actually, if you think again about the way these two figures relate, life needs earth to spring from. But actually, there's something about life that is, you know, more energetic and animated than mere earth on its own. So again, just we're thinking about the particular ways in which Eve seems to have something quite special about her. There's an energy in her name, really, which may not quite be there in Adam's.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
So what's so bad about this fruit? What's so, in your different understandings, what's so wrong about eating this fruit? Who wants to go first?
So what was wrong about it is that it was forbidden to eat from it. So I think that's quite clear. You already said it's an act of disobedience, and I think that would also be the Islamic interpretation of it. There's also one further character involved, and that's shaitan from an Islamic perspective. So it's not the serpent, but it's shaitan. And shaitan really makes them disobey. So there's also this element of seduction involved, but not by the part of Eve, but of shaitan. At the end, of course, they are thrown out of paradise, but God forgives them. So he says, I forgive you, and Adam receives words, and this is interpreted as being the first revelation. So in a way, Adam becomes the first prophet.
Mira, you were talking about the forgiveness that Eve receives afterwards. The Christian tradition sees this forgiveness as deferred a long, long time, until a long, long time later, when Jesus will then pay the price for this sin in being crucified. So he's like a new Adam. And actually his mother, Mary, is compared often to a new Eve, because just as her disobedience led to Adam's sin and the fall, Mary's obedience, because she says yes to God, leads to Christ's birth and this new beginning for creation. But it's an awfully long time to wait. And perhaps one of the difficult parts of that legacy is that Eve has become very typically presented as the sort of archetypal temptress, the female as temptress. And Mary's perhaps been held up as an almost impossible ideal of womanhood, submissive, pure and obedient. And I think we're still trying to find ways through that legacy today.
We have that very often, women in general being split between the good ones and the bad ones. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that Jewish tradition has another person for the bad one. So Eve, actually, Chava is the good one. There is Lilith. She's one of the demons. She threatens women during childbirth. So Chava stands there as the good one. And Lilith, there are some very explicit sexual descriptions also why she is the bad one. And the interesting thing is that today, I think the Christian image of Eve has somehow filtered even into Judaism. So we need to redefine, and actually it's really not a big issue in the Jewish tradition, this story. Probably, knowing good and bad and knowing how to differentiate between good and bad actually is not so bad, right?
Yeah. Whereas in Christianity, it's a big deal, as you know, because this event is being given the name The Fall. And it's the fall of humanity from paradise into a world of pain and suffering and violence. And so all of the suffering and wickedness of human history is traced back to this one act.
It was interesting to hear you talking about the question whether Christian thinking came into Judaism here. I think when we look at the Quran, it's interesting to keep in mind that this discussion was already there when it appeared, and therefore the fact that Eve is not the one who takes the fruit, so she does not have the guilt on her, is already a reaction to Christian reception of the story. There's also a very clear verse in the Quran that also says that the angels didn't like the idea of God creating human beings, and it has to do with sin. So God says, I will create a vicegerent on earth, and then the angels say, أَتَجْعَلْ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا? Are you going to place someone there who will create disaster and shed blood? And the angels were right, because there's so much bloodshed and destruction on earth, exactly the thing which the angels foresaw. So there's always this hope in the divine will to create human beings, even if it was clear from the beginning that they will sin and do bad things. But human beings have the potentiality to do good. So I would also see this as being one central message of this creation narrative, because it's about sinning, but it's also about the decision whether to do good or bad.
Yeah, it's like a fall into a world of making, of decision making, and bodily life.
Yeah.
And thinking of that, this is one last thing I'd love just to dwell on, which is the rib. When you were saying, Giza, that certain things from Christianity had filtered into Judaism, one of the things I wish could filter into Christianity from Judaism's side is that tradition, which I think you just hinted at earlier on, which is, it wasn't necessarily just a rib, one bone, but actually a whole side of the original human. And this seems to me such a rich and interesting idea. Would you say something about that?
So there are these two traditions. One is really the sela can be a rib, but normally it's the side. So it really is this image of the first person being split into two persons. There is Adam as the first person, and then Adam is looking at all the animals and not finding a partner there. And God has created humans as God's partner, but then the human being needs a partner amongst, the same kind. A later tradition uses actually, and that's where traditions mix again, when it says in the Bible, "Zacharu nekeva baraotam," male and female humans were created. The Midrash says, the rabbinic explanation says, "androgynos baraotam." And I still remember in one seminar at university when I was so proud that I found this Midrash. And then the professor said, yeah, but you cannot use Hellenistic expressions to explain Jewish tradition because this is not the pure Judaism. And I said, well, actually, Judaism has always been in dialogue with the other traditions, right? So if you can write androgynos, and if you see that written in Hebrew, you really need a long time to even decipher it because it looks very strange. Androgynos refers back to Plato's idea of humans being created as a ball with two identities, and then the ball was split. And there are different versions, right? Some say, okay, it's male and female that was split, but obviously Plato had different kinds of kugel, ball beings, both being male, both being female, or being male and female. And I like to add to that, maybe also the splitting did not go between male and female, so you have all kinds of diverse identities which are there already. So it's about equality and it's about diversity already there in the ancient text, if you want to read it and if you want to see it.
And exactly in that time when these Hellenistic traditions were around, that's the environment in which the Quran emerges. And therefore, no wonder exactly that tradition also is part of the Quran. And I said before that the creation narrative is retold several times in the Quran. So you cannot find it in one surah, but you have to look up many different surahs and you'll several times read the creation narrative. But in one surah, and that's the fourth surah, Surat An-Nisa, the surah of the women, the very first verse talks about creation. And that's such a prominent place to place something about creation. And it says, يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء. O you human beings, fear God who created you from a single being. And then he created from this single being his or her partner, and from both of them he created many men and women. And of course, if you read it against this midrash, which you just mentioned, then it makes a lot of sense why it says from a single human being, from a single soul, as it is sometimes translated. So the first human being who is actually not Adam and who is not Eve, but who is one human being, the first human being, combining genders.
Mm-hmm. Well, the mother of all living things, perhaps even with this further androgynous source behind her, but here she is in the border. And I hope that in our delight in discovering what we share and also some of the things that we add to each other's perspectives, we've given people an appetite. Maybe I shouldn't talk about appetite in front of these apples, these fruits, but we've given people an appetite to come and explore this and so many other images here in the Buddha for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.